of U.S. control, might well have a domino effect, inspiring others who face similar problems to pursue the same course, thus eroding the global system of domination. That is why it was constantly necessary to sell intervention by creating the misimpression that it is the Soviet Union that you are fighting, or China, or the Sino-Soviet Axis, or the Huns, Woodrow Wilson's pretext for invading Haiti and the Dominican Republic, or narco-traffickers, or whatever can be conjured up. On these matters, the documentary record is rich and remarkably consistent. Such misimpressions commonly provide the framework, not only for public discourse, but also for the intelligence services. Perhaps the most striking example, considerably more significant than the much-discussed case of Iraq, is revealed in the Pentagon Papers. When Washington decided to support France's reconquest of Vietnam, intelligence was instructed to demonstrate that the Viet Minh resistance was a mere tool of Russia or China, or both. With great effort, intelligence was able to discover only that Hanoi appeared to be the one place in the region lacking such contacts. That was taken to be proof that Ho Chi Minh was such a loyal puppet. He had a special dispensation with no need for instructions. U.S. intelligence was so deeply indoctrinated that for the 2-decade period recorded in the Pentagon Papers up to 1968, it was scarcely able even to entertain the possibility that North Vietnam might be pursuing national interests rather than serving as a loyal puppet of its masters. Hardly in question, whatever one thinks of Hanoi. The South Vietnamese resistance, NLF, was simply dismissed, except on the ground where it was the commanding presence. Unquestioned power. Prior to World War II, the United States, though by far the world's richest economy, had not been a major global actor. Its reach extended to its own region, with forays into the Pacific, and by the 1920s, initiatives began to gain a share of the vast energy resources of the Middle East. But even before the United States entered the war, high-level planners and foreign policy advisors recognized that it should be able to hold unquestioned power in the new global system, ensuring the limitation of any exercise of sovereignty by states that might interfere with its designs. They also developed an integrated policy to achieve military and economic supremacy for the United States in the Grand Area, which was to include at least the Western Hemisphere, the former British Empire, and the Far East. As the war progressed, and it became clear that Soviet military power had crushed Hitler's Reich, Grand Area planning was extended to include as much of Eurasia as possible. Since that time, the world has undergone many dramatic changes, but no less striking, and of far-reaching significance for the future, are the fundamental continuities in these policies, with tactical modifications and shifting of justifications adapted to circumstances. During World War II, Joseph Stalin became an ally, the beloved Uncle Joe, as Russia first endured and then beat back the Nazi wave. It cannot be overemphasized, historian Omer Bartov writes, that however criminal and odious Stalin's regime surely was, without the Red Army and its horrendous blood sacrifice, the Wehrmacht would not have been defeated, and Nazism would have remained a fact in Europe for many generations. Roosevelt scholar Warren Kimball concludes that when military assessments pointed out that only the Red Army could achieve victory over Hitler in a land war, aid to the Soviet Union became a presidential priority, on the assumption that the Russian army would grind Germany down and keep U.S. soldiers out of a land war. Roosevelt's strategy was for the United States to be the reserves, he confided privately. Nevertheless, Roosevelt treated the aid to Russia program more as a matter of good faith than for its value to the Soviet war effort, Kimball adds, estimating its value at about 10% of Russian production, making it critical but secondary to Roosevelt's broader plans. His design, unchanged to the end, Gaddis observes, was that U.S. allies should do most of the fighting in Europe so as to keep U.S. casualties to a minimum. Allies meant mostly Russians. For every U.S. soldier who died fighting the war, some 60 Russians were doing so. A corresponding intention, largely achieved, was that in the Pacific, the United States would have total domination, with no interference from allies, or even participation from the major victims of Japanese aggression. In the early stages of the war, Harry Truman's view was simple. If we see that Germany is winning, we ought to help Russia, and if Russia is winning, we ought to help Germany, and that way let them kill as many as possible. What political scientist Timothy Crawford calls a pivotal strategy to prolong war. Truman's generally pragmatic view was tempered, however, by his genuine affection and admiration for Old Joe, whom he regarded as a decent fellow who can't do what he wants to because, as Truman put it in 1948, he is a prisoner of the Politburo. Truman stopped expressing such views publicly when his advisers convinced him that doing so was a damaging blunder. But in private, he continued to describe Old Joe as honest and straightforward, as near like Tom Pendergast as any man I know, referring to the Missouri boss who launched his political career. As president, Truman felt that he could get along with a tyrant as long as the United States got its way 85% of the time. War planners took a much dimmer view. The British, in particular, regarded the Western Soviet wartime alliance as an aberration from the start. From early 1944, Western military intelligence was marking the Soviets as the next enemy, and withholding crucial information about German forces from the Russians, while obtaining superbly detailed and accurate information about Russian military forces. Almost all Western-Russian intelligence cooperation ceased by the end of 1944, and British and U.S. intelligence began gathering information for air attacks against Russia. Field Marshal Sir Alan Brooke, the British wartime chief of the Imperial General Staff, had always loathed what he called this semi-Asiatic race, who were perhaps almost as degraded as the little yellow dwarf slaves in Japan who disgusted Sir Alexander Cadogan, the senior official at the Foreign Office. Brooke concluded in 1943 that the USSR cannot fail to become the main threat after the war, so that it would be necessary to foster Germany, gradually build her up, and bring her into the Federation of Western Europe, though it was a difficult policy to carry out under the cloak of a holy alliance between England, Russia, and America. Richard Aldrich observes that, like Harry S. Truman in Washington, Brooke and his Deputy General Henry Pownall rejoiced to see Germany and Russia going for each other with vigor. By late 1944, the British military was producing war plans, including rearming of Germany for the planned attack against Russia. British intelligence had also found super-secret appreciations of the Soviet Union as the next enemy that were circulating in Washington. In May 1945, as the war against Germany ended, Churchill ordered war plans to be drawn up for Operation Unthinkable. His stated objective was the elimination of Russia, Aldrich writes. The plans, only declassified in 1999, called for a surprise attack by hundreds of thousands of British and American troops, joined by 100,000 rearmed German soldiers, while the Royal Air Force would attack Soviet cities from bases in Northern Europe. Nuclear weapons were soon added to the mix. Earlier, Cadogan had raged about how the Russians are dominated by an almost insane suspicion, requiring infinite patience as we tried to deal with them, as though we thought they were reasonable human beings. The dilemma is a persistent one in attempts to deal with the unpeople of the world. 30 years after the criminal atrocities he directed, Robert McNamara was still puzzling over the unwillingness of the South Vietnamese resistance to lay down their arms and become part of an independent, non-communist South Vietnam following the path of Indonesia, which had reversed course after the killing of 300,000